Human males do not have a mating season, Professor Rylock said calmly, and for the first time that morning the massive xenobiology lecture hall fell completely silent. Hundreds of students from dozens of worlds stared at the rotating hologram above the podium, a detailed anatomical model of a human male slowly turning in the air like a specimen under glass. The chamber lights dimmed slightly, casting long blue reflections across the polished metal desks, while the low hum of the Academy's atmospheric system filled the stillness. Aria the Lin felt her fingers freeze over her datapad. She blinked once, convinced she had misunderstood the translation. Around her, murmurs rippled through the alien students seated in curved rows that climbed toward the domed ceiling. The Galactic Academy prided itself on exposing young scholars to strange species and stranger ideas, but this sounded biologically irrational. Professor Rylox tapped the console beside him, and several lines of data appeared next to the hologram. Hormonal graphs, reproductive timelines, behavioral markers. Most advanced species, he continued in his slow, gravelly voice, develop defined mating cycles. Seasonal fertility ensures population balance and biological stability. Humans, however, evolved differently. A new chart appeared, glowing amber in the dim lecture hall. Human males remain fertile continuously. The murmurs grew louder. Aria's four-fingered hand hovered over the datapad, while her violet eyes studied the figure in the hologram. Pink-toned skin, dense musculature, an upright posture that suggested equal parts curiosity and stubbornness. Humans had joined the galactic community only a few decades earlier, yet they were already the subject of intense scientific debate. Their technological progress was unusually fast, their cultural adaptability even faster. But their biology was beginning to look like an evolutionary anomaly. To clarify, Professor Rylox added, flicking his forked tongue thoughtfully as he examined the audience. Human males do not require a mating season to reproduce. The silence that followed was heavy enough to feel. Aria's datapad finally beeped as her research program resumed recording notes. She wrote a single line across the glowing screen. Continuous fertility. No cycle limitation. Potential behavioral implications, unknown. Her mind raced through possibilities. Species with uncontrolled reproductive capability usually compensated with strict hormonal regulators or environmental triggers. Without those safeguards, a civilization could collapse into chaos. Yet humans had somehow built cities, starships, and a growing interstellar presence. That contradiction fascinated her. Slowly, her gaze drifted away from the hologram and toward the lower rows of the lecture hall. The human exchange students sat together near the front, their relaxed posture sharply different from the rigid attentiveness of most alien scholars. One of them leaned back slightly in his seat, arms folded, expression caught somewhere between amusement and mild embarrassment. Lucas Walker. The Academy roster displayed his name beside a small Terran flag icon. Aria had noticed him earlier in the semester. Not because he was loud or disruptive, quite the opposite. Humans carried themselves with a strange, grounded confidence that didn't rely on height or armor or ceremonial markings. Lucas Walker had light skin, short brown hair, and the kind of easy posture that suggested he was comfortable in almost any environment. At that moment he rubbed the back of his neck while a few nearby students whispered among themselves. He looked like someone who had just realized an entire lecture hall was analyzing a private detail of his species. Aria's pulse quickened with curiosity. Continuous fertility. No seasonal limitation. She glanced down at her datapad again and began writing faster. If the data was correct, human reproductive biology represented one of the most unusual evolutionary paths in the known galaxy. But what intrigued her even more was the behavioral question. If a species possessed such constant capability, what prevented them from acting on it at all times? The answer might reveal something deeper about human psychology, or something dangerous. Aria lifted her gaze once more and studied Lucas Walker carefully. He shifted slightly in his seat and glanced toward the ceiling, as if hoping the lecture might end sooner rather than later. He did not look like a dangerous creature. He looked like a tired college student who had been accidentally volunteered as the subject of a very awkward biology lesson. And yet, according to the professor's data, the quiet human sitting 3 rows below her might represent one of the most biologically unusual organisms in the entire galaxy. Ariadne slowly saved her notes and made a decision. If she wanted to understand the mystery of human reproduction, she would need more than charts and lecture slides. She would need to observe a human directly. And the most convenient specimen in the academy was already sitting in front of her. Ariadne did not leave the lecture hall immediately when the class ended. The seats around her emptied slowly as students gathered their datapads and whispered among themselves, their voices carrying a mixture of fascination and disbelief. Several reptilian students argued quietly about endocrine regulation, while a pair of insectoid scholars replayed the professor's data charts in mid-air projections. Aria remained seated, her violet eyes focused on the human rows near the front. Lucas Walker stood from his chair and stretched his arms above his head in a casual motion that looked almost careless compared to the rigid discipline common among academy species. His posture was relaxed, his shoulders broad, his expression calm despite the fact that the entire lecture had essentially turned his species into a biological curiosity. Arias studied him carefully while the last of the lecture hall lights brightened to full intensity. Humans were still relatively new to the interstellar academic system, but their reputation had spread quickly. They were considered adaptable, unpredictable, and occasionally reckless, yet they were also strangely cooperative. Those traits alone made them worthy of research, but the biological detail revealed today changed the equation entirely. A species capable of constant fertility without descending into social instability should not logically exist. Yet here Lucas Walker stood, casually sliding his datapad into his shoulder bag as though nothing unusual had been discussed at all. Aria lowered her gaze to her own datapad and opened a fresh research entry. Subject candidate, Lucas Walker. Species, human male. Status, exchange student, Earth origin. Behavioral observation required. She hesitated for only a moment before standing and stepping into the aisle. The floor panels beneath her boots gave off a soft metallic echo as she moved down the curved rows of seats. By the time she reached the lower level of the hall, Lucas was already walking toward the exit corridor where a stream of alien students flowed through the wide archway leading into the main academic concourse. The corridor outside the lecture hall was nearly 100 feet long and lined with transparent panels that revealed the enormous interior garden of the Academy Dome. Artificial sunlight filtered through the glass above, illuminating hanging vines and floating botanical drones that quietly maintained the ecosystem. Lucas slowed slightly near a water station mounted into the wall. He pressed a small control panel and filled a clear container with chilled water before turning back toward the corridor traffic. That was when he noticed her. Aria stopped, 3 feet away from him, standing slightly taller due to the elongated proportions of her species. Her skin carried the faint iridescent blue tone of the Azurian people, shifting subtly in the artificial sunlight. Lucas blinked once in mild surprise before offering a polite smile that looked both friendly and slightly cautious. Humans often smiled during social introductions, a behavior many alien cultures initially misinterpreted as a dominance display. Aria already knew this from her research. "Hello," Lucas said. His voice was steady and warm, carrying the relaxed cadence typical of North American English speakers. "You were in the xenobiology lecture, right?" Aria nodded slowly, studying his facial expressions with careful attention. "Yes, I am Aria the Lin, Graduate Research Division." Lucas adjusted the strap of his bag over his shoulder. "Lucas Walker, Environmental Systems Program. Although apparently today, I was also a walking biology exhibit." His attempt at humor caused the corners of Aria's eyes to narrow slightly in analytical focus. Humor under scrutiny conditions suggested social confidence. Another unusual trait. She decided not to waste time with indirect conversation. "Lucas Walker," she said calmly, holding up her datapad as though referencing an official document. "I would like to ask you a scientific question." Lucas raised an eyebrow. "That sounds serious." Aria tilted her head slightly, her violet eyes reflecting the garden light behind him. "According to Professor Rylox, human males remain reproductively capable at all times." Lucas froze for half a second. The pause was brief but noticeable. Aria recorded the reaction instantly in her mental notes. Human behavioral response to reproductive discussion, mild discomfort. "Technically speaking," Lucas said slowly, "that is accurate." Aria nodded once, as if confirming a mathematical equation. Then she asked the question that had been forming in her mind since the lecture began. In that case, she said with perfect seriousness, are you currently fertile? Lucas Walker stared at Area the Lin for a moment as the question settled in the air between them. Around them, the academy corridor continued its usual rhythm, students from distant star systems moving past in small groups, while soft mechanical drones floated along the ceiling maintaining the environmental systems. The enormous garden dome beyond the transparent wall panels shimmered under simulated sunlight, casting reflections across the polished metal floor. None of that seemed to matter to Lucas in that moment. He blinked once, then twice, trying to decide whether he had heard the alien student correctly. Arya watched him closely, her posture perfectly composed, her datapad held against her side like a scientist waiting for a measurement to stabilize. Lucas let out a quiet breath through his nose and rubbed the back of his neck, a small human gesture that often appeared when someone was searching for the right words. That might be the most direct question anyone has ever asked me at this school, he said slowly. Arya tilted her head slightly, her violet eyes reflecting the moving light of the garden outside. Was the question incorrect? She asked with complete seriousness. Lucas shook his head. No, it was just unexpected. He shifted his weight and took a sip from the water container still in his hand before answering. Technically speaking, human biology does allow that possibility most of the time. Arya immediately tapped her datapad, recording the response. Lucas noticed the motion and gave a small laugh that carried a mix of disbelief and amusement. You are actually documenting this conversation, are you not? Arya nodded once. Yes. Your species displays several evolutionary patterns that are scientifically unusual. Continuous fertility without social instability is one of them. Lucas lowered the container and studied her for a moment. Up close, he could see faint lines of light beneath the blue tone of her skin, subtle biological patterns that shifted when she moved. Her expression remained calm, analytical, almost clinical. So let me guess, he said. You are writing a research paper about humans. Arya considered the statement carefully before answering. Possibly. However, first, I must determine whether the biological data presented in the lecture corresponds with observable behavior. Lucas folded his arms lightly across his chest, still smiling. And I am the observable behavior. You are the nearest available subject, Arya replied without hesitation. Lucas laughed again, a quiet sound that drew a curious glance from a passing student with translucent wings. Well, that is flattering in a strange scientific way. Arya studied the reaction carefully. Human humor response during reproductive discussion, stable emotional control. She added another line to her notes. Lucas noticed her continued observations and raised an eyebrow. Out of curiosity, he said, how many other students have asked that question today? Arya paused for a fraction of a second, then answered truthfully. None. Lucas nodded slowly. That tracks. For a moment, both of them stood in silence while the corridor traffic flowed around them. Arya broke the pause first. Lucas Walker, I would like to conduct further observation of human behavior patterns. Lucas gave her a skeptical look. Observation meaning what exactly? Arya lifted her datapad and displayed a blank research schedule. You will continue your normal daily activities while I record behavioral data. Social interaction, decision-making, environmental responses. Lucas leaned slightly closer to read the screen. The list of categories looked surprisingly organized. He straightened again and looked at her with a half-amused expression. So your research plan is basically to follow me around campus. Arya nodded. Yes. Lucas let out a soft breath and glanced down the corridor toward the exit leading to the cafeteria level of the academy complex. You know what, he said finally. Compared to some of the group projects here, that might actually be the least strange thing I deal with this semester. Arya's eyes narrowed slightly with interest. You accept? Lucas shrugged lightly. Sure. As long as you promise not to ask that first question every 5 minutes. Arya studied his face, analyzing tone and micro-expressions before responding. That would not be scientifically efficient. Lucas smiled again. Good. Because I have a class in 10 minutes, and I would prefer not to explain that conversation to my professor. Without another word, he turned and started walking down the corridor toward the lower campus levels. Arya the Lin watched him go for 2 seconds before calmly stepping forward to follow the most interesting biological subject she had ever encountered. Lucas Walker did not slow down as he moved through the wide corridor that spiraled down toward the lower levels of the Academy complex, an area the Lin followed him at a measured pace exactly 3 steps behind, her violet eyes quietly observing everything he did. The Galactic Academy covered nearly 2 square miles under a massive transparent dome, and the mid-level concourse stretched almost half a mile from the lecture halls to the central cafeteria district. Students from dozens of species moved through the passageways, some floating, some walking, others gliding on magnetic platforms that hummed softly above the polished metal floor. Lucas walked through the crowd with relaxed familiarity, occasionally nodding at people he recognized while adjusting the strap of his bag across his shoulder. Arya noticed immediately that his pace adjusted slightly when smaller species crossed the corridor ahead of him. Human behavioral adaptation to environmental variables, she noted silently before recording the observation into her datapad. Lucas passed a maintenance drone that was struggling to lift a small service panel near the wall. The drone emitted a faint electronic chirp as its manipulator arm slipped against the metal casing. Lucas slowed, crouched briefly, and steadied the panel with one hand while the drone secured it in place. The machine responded with a soft confirmation tone before floating away toward the ceiling maintenance track. Lucas stood again and continued walking as though the interruption had been insignificant. Arya watched the entire exchange with intense focus. Assistant's behavior toward non-sentient machines without expectation of reward. She typed quickly into her notes. The corridor gradually widened until it opened into the central cafeteria plaza, a circular space nearly 200 feet across with tiered seating areas and long food service counters that displayed cuisine from dozens of worlds. The air carried a mixture of unfamiliar scents, warm bread, citrus vapors, mineral spice blends, and the faint electric aroma of synthetic nutrition packs. Lucas stepped into the food line without hesitation. Arya positioned herself beside him, her datapad still active. Lucas glanced sideways at her. "You are actually going to record me eating lunch, are you not?" Arya answered calmly. Food selection and nutritional preference can reveal behavioral patterns. Lucas shook his head with quiet amusement and picked up a tray from the dispenser. The menu display above the counter shifted languages automatically when it detected his presence. He selected a grilled vegetable wrap, a small bowl of rice, and a bottle of water before moving down the counter. Arya selected nothing. Instead, she continued watching. Lucas paused at a nearby table where a small 4-limbed student from a desert world struggled to balance a tall container of liquid while carrying 3 datapads at once. Without hesitation, Lucas reached out and steadied the container before it tipped over the table. The smaller student looked up in surprise and chirped a brief expression of gratitude before hurrying away toward the seating tiers. Lucas sat down and finally noticed Arya still standing beside him. "You know," he said while opening the wrap container, "most research assistants eventually order food too." Arya lowered herself into the chair across from him with deliberate precision. Azurian physiology requires fewer caloric intervals. During daylight cycles, she explained. Lucas nodded slowly. That makes sense. He took a bite of the wrap and chewed thoughtfully for a moment before pointing at her datapad with the corner of his fork. "So what does the research say so far?" Arya reviewed the screen for several seconds before answering. "Your behavior does not match the theoretical model." Lucas raised an eyebrow. "What model is that?" Arya spoke with complete seriousness. "A species capable of constant reproductive potential should display increased competitive behavior and territorial aggression." Lucas swallowed his food and leaned back slightly in his chair. "Well, that sounds exhausting." Arya studied him carefully. "Yet you display cooperative tendencies instead." Lucas gave a small shrug. "Most humans do." Arya's violet eyes narrowed slightly with growing curiosity. She tapped another entry into her notes. Continuous fertility. Cooperative social pattern. Behavioral contradiction unresolved. Across the table, Lucas Walker finished his meal with casual calm, while the alien researcher watching him realized that the most unusual part of human biology might not be what they were capable of doing, but what they chose not to do. The cafeteria plaza slowly thinned as the midday academic cycle moved students back toward their laboratories and lecture halls. Lucas Walker finished the last bite of his meal and set the empty container aside, while the overhead lighting shifted slightly to match the artificial afternoon schedule of the Academy Dome. Area the Lin remained seated across from him, her datapad balanced carefully in her hands as lines of observational notes scrolled across the screen. Lucas noticed the focused look in her violet eyes and leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table. "All right," he said with mild curiosity. "I have been observed walking, eating, helping a maintenance drone, and rescuing someone's drink from disaster. What does the official research report say about humans now?" Arias studied the screen before answering with calm precision. "The current data suggests that your species demonstrates strong cooperative instincts even when no biological reward is immediately present." Lucas smiled faintly. "That sounds about right." Aria tilted her head slightly, still examining him. However, the central question remains unresolved. Lucas raised an eyebrow. "Which question is that?" Aria answered without hesitation. "Why a species with constant reproductive capability does not behave as though reproduction is its primary objective." Lucas sat back in his chair and looked upward toward the enormous glass dome where several small atmospheric drones drifted slowly between the support beams. For a few seconds he appeared to be thinking about how to explain something that humans normally never needed to explain. Finally he looked back at her and spoke with an easy tone that carried the calm confidence she had noticed earlier. "Because humans are more complicated than our biology." Aria recorded the statement immediately. Lucas noticed and chuckled quietly. "Let me guess. That line is going straight into the research paper." "Possibly," Aria replied. Lucas stood and picked up his tray, sliding it into a recycling slot built into the side of the cafeteria wall. The machine hummed softly as it processed the container into raw material. When he turned back, Aria had already stood and resumed her position beside him, datapad ready. Lucas shook his head with mild amusement. "You are serious about this observation project?" "Yes," Aria replied simply. "Your species displays a pattern that contradicts several known evolutionary models." Lucas started walking toward the corridor that led to the environmental engineering wing of the Academy. Aria followed beside him this time rather than behind him, her long stride matching his pace almost perfectly. The hallway ahead stretched nearly 300 feet and was lined with tall windows that overlooked the Academy's lower research gardens where students tested alien crops and atmospheric plants from different star systems. Lucas gestured toward the gardens as they walked. "My next class studies ecosystem balance for mixed planetary colonies. Humans have to figure out how to grow food on worlds that were never meant for us." Aria glanced through the glass where rows of strange blue plants floated in hydroponic trays while robotic arms adjusted nutrient levels. "You alter environments instead of adapting to them," she observed. Lucas shrugged lightly. "A little of both." A group of tall crystalline students passed them moving in the opposite direction, their bodies refracting the overhead light like walking prisms. Lucas stepped slightly to the side to give them space before continuing forward. Aria noticed the adjustment instantly and logged the behavior. Environmental courtesy response. Lucas noticed the datapad movement and smiled again. "You know, if you keep recording everything I do, you might eventually discover something very boring." Aria looked at him with genuine curiosity. Boring behavior can still be scientifically valuable. Lucas laughed quietly. "That might be the most academic sentence I have ever heard." They reached the entrance to the environmental laboratory wing where a large digital clock displayed the Academy time cycle. Lucas glanced at it and sighed softly. 5 minutes until class. Aria stopped beside the doorway and looked up at the sign identifying the laboratory complex. "Observation will continue," she said calmly. Lucas nodded and stepped through the door. Aria followed, unaware that with every new note she recorded the mystery she was trying to solve was slowly shifting from biology to something far more human. The environmental laboratory wing of the Galactic Academy stretched across nearly a quarter-mile of the lower dome, a massive complex of transparent chambers, climate control corridors, and suspended observation platforms where dozens of ecosystems were maintained for study. Lucas Walker stepped through the sliding door, and immediately the temperature shifted slightly cooler, the air carrying a faint scent of mineral-rich water and growing plants. The lab space ahead opened into a wide circular chamber nearly 80 feet across, where rows of hydroponic towers rose toward the ceiling like living columns of green and blue vegetation from different star systems. Students were already gathering around workstations while a tall instructor with silver skin adjusted a holographic display floating above a central console. Lucas moved toward one of the side work tables with the quiet familiarity of someone who had spent many hours in the room. Aria the Lin followed several steps behind, her datapad active as she quietly observed everything. The instructor noticed her presence almost immediately and raised one smooth metallic eyebrow. "Miss the Lin," the professor said in a calm voice that carried across the chamber. "This is an environmental systems course." Aria nodded politely. "I am conducting observational research on human behavioral patterns." The instructor glanced toward Lucas Walker, who lifted his hands slightly in a gesture of innocent surrender. A few nearby students chuckled softly. The professor considered this explanation for a moment before nodding once. "Very well. Observation is also a form of education." With that, the instructor resumed, adjusting the display. A rotating model of a planetary ecosystem appeared above the console, showing temperature layers, rainfall patterns, and plant growth zones across a simulated world. Lucas took his seat at a workstation equipped with soil sensors and nutrient analysis tools. Aria positioned herself beside the station, standing just far enough away not to interfere while still able to record every detail. Lucas began calibrating a handheld scanner and glanced sideways at her. "You are going to write down how I test soil samples, are you not?" Aria answered calmly. "Yes." Lucas gave a quiet laugh and returned his attention to the equipment. The scanner emitted a soft tone as it analyzed a tray of violet-colored plant roots growing in a shallow nutrient bed. Aria watched carefully. "Explain your procedure," she said. Lucas adjusted the scanner settings and spoke while working. "Different planets have different mineral balances. If we want crops to survive on a new colony world, we have to understand how to adapt the soil environment. Sometimes that means adding nutrients. Sometimes it means removing them." Aria recorded the explanation immediately. "Human strategy: modify ecosystem variables to support life." The instructor began walking through the room, occasionally stopping beside student stations to review their data. When the professor reached Lucas's workstation, he nodded approvingly at the analysis display. "Accurate readings as usual, Mr. Walker." Lucas shrugged lightly. "Plants are honest. They tell you what they need." Aria looked at the display screen, showing root growth patterns spreading through the nutrient bed. "Your species invests significant effort into sustaining life forms that are not your own," she observed. Lucas glanced at her and smiled slightly. "If we want to survive on other worlds, we have to learn how to take care of them." Aria paused, her violet eyes narrowing with thoughtful curiosity as she typed another entry into her datapad. "Continuous fertility species demonstrates environmental stewardship rather than dominance behavior." Across the laboratory, the class continued quietly, students adjusting nutrient levels and recording growth data while the artificial sunlight above the hydroponic towers shifted to simulate late afternoon. Lucas Walker worked with calm focus, occasionally brushing soil particles from his hands while monitoring the sensor readings. Beside him, Aria the Lin continued documenting every small action, yet the deeper question forming in her mind was becoming harder to ignore. The human she was studying did not behave like a species driven by constant biological impulse. Instead, he behaved like someone who spent most of his time trying to help fragile things survive. The environmental laboratory slowly shifted into its late cycle rhythm as the instructor dimmed several of the overhead growth lamps, and the hydroponic towers adjusted their artificial sunlight spectrum to simulate early evening conditions on a temperate world. Lucas Walker finished logging the final nutrient readings into the workstation console and wiped a thin layer of soil from his hands with a cloth resting beside the scanner. Around the room, other students were sealing their sample trays or recording the last measurements of the session, while quiet mechanical arms inside the hydroponic columns adjusted water flow with precise movements. Aria the Lin remained beside Lucas's station with her datapad still active, but her attention had shifted away from the numbers on the screen and toward the pattern she had been observing all afternoon. Lucas noticed the thoughtful look in her violet eyes and tilted his head slightly. "You have been very quiet for the last 10 minutes, he said. "Did your research reach a conclusion?" Aria glanced down at her notes and then back at him. "It reached a contradiction." Lucas leaned back against the edge of the workstation and folded his arms lightly. Those are usually the interesting ones. Arya stepped closer to the hydroponic tray where the violet plants were growing in neat rows under the filtered light. Your species possesses biological capabilities that should prioritize reproduction above most other behaviors, she said calmly. Yet throughout this observation period you have prioritized assistance, cooperation, and environmental maintenance instead. Lucas followed her gaze to the plants for a moment before answering. Taking care of things tends to keep them alive. Arya typed a few more notes into her datapad, but her expression remained puzzled. Evolutionary theory predicts that a species with continuous reproductive potential should compete aggressively for resources and partners. Lucas considered that statement for several seconds before giving a small, thoughtful nod. That probably happened a long time ago. Arya looked at him again. What changed? Lucas rested one hand lightly on the edge of the hydroponic bed and looked across the laboratory where several smaller students were carefully carrying fragile plant samples toward the storage cabinets. Humans learned that survival does not come from competing all the time, he said quietly. It comes from cooperation. Arya recorded the sentence exactly as he said it. At that moment, a sudden electronic tone echoed softly through the laboratory as one of the hydroponic towers emitted a warning signal. A small indicator light blinked amber along the side of the structure, while a panel displayed fluctuating moisture levels. The instructor moved toward the tower immediately, but Lucas was already standing beside it checking the nutrient feed line. Arya watched as he adjusted a small valve and recalibrated the moisture regulator using the handheld scanner. Within a few seconds the warning light faded, and the tower returned to its normal steady glow. The instructor nodded approvingly before returning to the central console. Lucas stepped back and brushed his hands together again. Arya recorded the event carefully. Rapid problem response. Cooperative maintenance behavior. Lucas noticed her writing and smiled faintly. You are going to end up with a very long report. Arya paused before responding. Yes. Lucas picked up his bag from the workstation chair as the instructor announced the end of the session. Students began moving toward the exit corridor while the hydroponic towers shifted into their automated nighttime cycle. Lucas started walking toward the door, and Arya followed beside him. As they stepped into the hallway, the artificial lighting dimmed slightly to simulate sunset across the academy dome. Arya glanced at Lucas Walker once more while her datapad displayed the growing list of observations. For the first time since beginning the study, she realized the most unusual trait she had discovered was not the biology she had expected to analyze. It was the quiet consistency of a human choosing kindness, even when no biological instinct required it. The corridor outside the environmental laboratory had grown quieter as the academy entered its evening cycle. Soft amber lighting now replaced the brighter daylight spectrum along the ceiling panels, and the enormous glass dome above the complex slowly darkened to simulate the natural twilight of a temperate world. Lucas Walker walked at an easy pace down the wide hallway, his shoulder bag resting comfortably against his side, while the faint sound of distant ventilation systems hummed through the structure of the station. Beside him, Arya the Lin continued reviewing the long column of observations on her datapad. For several minutes, she remained silent, replaying each event of the day in careful order. Lucas noticed her focused expression and glanced toward the transparent wall that revealed the academy gardens below them. That look usually means someone is solving a complicated equation, he said casually. Arya lifted her eyes from the screen and looked directly at him. I am attempting to understand a contradiction. Lucas slowed slightly. The same one from earlier. Yes, Arya replied. Your biological capability should produce constant competitive behavior. Yet your actions today demonstrated patience, cooperation, and restraint. Lucas rested his forearm lightly on the railing that ran along the corridor and looked down into the gardens where several automated drones were dimming the growth lights above rows of alien crops. Humans have instincts, he said calmly. But instincts are not the same as choices. Arya processed the statement for a moment. Explain the difference. Lucas turned slightly so that he faced her more directly. The fading artificial sunlight from the dome above reflected softly against the pale tone of his skin and the calm expression in his eyes. Instinct tells you what you could do, he said. Choice decides what you should do. Arya typed the sentence into her datapad exactly as he spoke it. The words felt important, even if she could not yet explain why. They continued walking along the curved corridor until the path opened into a quiet observation balcony nearly 40 feet wide. From this vantage point, the interior of the Academy dome stretched in every direction, a vast landscape of gardens, research towers, and suspended walkways illuminated by the gentle glow of the simulated evening sky. Lucas paused near the railing and looked upward as small maintenance drones drifted silently between the structural beams nearly 200 feet above the ground. Arya stopped beside him. Your species appears to have developed social systems that regulate biological impulses, she said thoughtfully. Lucas nodded. Families, communities, laws, ethics. Arya looked down at the notes on her screen again. These systems override instinctive behavior. Lucas gave a small shrug. Sometimes they guided instead. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet of the observation deck allowed the soft, environmental sounds of the Academy to fill the space around them. Far below, students moved through the garden pathways while glowing plant clusters shifted color as their night cycle began. Arya finally looked back at Lucas. If humans possess constant reproductive capability, then theoretically they could behave very differently. Lucas gave a faint smile that held both humor and patience. Probably. Yet you do not. Lucas rested both hands on the railing and looked out across the vast dome where hundreds of fragile ecosystems were being maintained by the students and scientists of many worlds. Because humans eventually realized something important, he said quietly. Arya waited. Lucas looked back at her. The ability to do something does not mean you should. Arya stared at him for several seconds, as the meaning settled slowly in her mind. Then she added one final entry to her datapad. Human biological model revised. Continuous capability does not equal constant action. Decision-making guided by ethical framework. As the last light of the artificial sunset faded across the Academy dome, Arya the Lin realized the research she had started as a biological study was becoming something far more complex. She had not simply been observing a human body. She had been observing a human conscience. The observation balcony remained quiet as the artificial night settled across the vast interior of the Academy dome. The glass ceiling above now displayed a carefully simulated star field that mirrored the real sky beyond the station's orbit, and soft blue lights illuminated the long garden terraces that stretched nearly half a mile below. Lucas Walker stood beside the railing with the relaxed posture that had become familiar throughout the day, his hands resting lightly on the metal edge as he looked out across the quiet campus. Arya the Lin remained beside him, her datapad still open, though she had stopped typing several minutes earlier. The research log on the screen now contained dozens of observations collected from the moment she first approached him in the lecture corridor. Biological data, behavioral responses, social interactions, environmental actions. Each entry had begun as a piece of scientific evidence meant to explain the strange evolutionary detail discussed in class that morning. Yet the more she reviewed the notes, the more she realized the central question had changed entirely. Lucas noticed her thoughtful silence and glanced toward her. You look like someone who just finished solving a difficult problem, he said quietly. Arya lowered the datapad and looked out across the gardens again. Small glowing pathways wound through the vegetation, while distant students walked slowly between research plots under the gentle night lighting. I believe the original hypothesis was incorrect, she said calmly. Lucas nodded slightly. That happens a lot in science. Arya turned the datapad so that the screen faced him. The research summary glowed softly in the dim light. Lucas scanned the text for a moment before reading the final line aloud with a faint smile. Human biological model revised. He looked back at her. That sounds official. Arya studied him with the same analytical focus. She had carried throughout the entire day, yet there was something different in her expression now. The curiosity remained, but it had softened into something more reflective. When I first approached you, she said slowly, I believed your species was biologically unusual because of continuous reproductive capability. Lucas leaned back slightly against the railing and listened. Now I believe the unusual trait is something else. Lucas raised an eyebrow. What is that? Arya closed the datapad and held it quietly at her side. For several seconds, she seemed to consider the exact words she wanted to record in her final conclusion. Humans possess the ability to act on instinct at nearly any time, she said. Yet you consistently choose not to. Lucas looked back across the enormous dome where hundreds of fragile ecosystems were quietly thriving under the careful work of students from many different worlds. Most people would call that self-control, he said simply. Aria shook her head slightly. It is more than that. Lucas waited. Aria finally spoke the conclusion that had slowly formed from every observation she had recorded since the morning lecture. Your species is not defined by what your biology allows, she said softly. You are defined by what your conscience decides. Lucas remained quiet for a moment, then gave a small, thoughtful smile. That might be the nicest way anyone has ever described humans. Aria glanced once more at the silent campus stretching beneath the dome and then looked back at him. The research project she had begun as a scientific investigation had ended with an answer she had not expected to find. The most remarkable aspect of humanity was not the unusual biology that had shocked the lecture hall earlier that day. It was the quiet decision made again and again by individuals like Lucas Walker to guide their actions with judgment instead of impulse. As the simulated stars brightened across the ceiling of the Academy dome, Aria the Lin mentally finalized the conclusion she would submit to the Xenobiology department the following morning. Humans are not extraordinary because they are always capable of reproduction. Humans are extraordinary because they are always capable of choosing restraint.